That truck. My father owned this truck. Richard didn't recognize the old Chevy because of its engine. He recognized it because his father had disappeared with that
Richard didn't
truck
recognize
32
the
years
old
ago.
Chevy because of its engine. He recognized it because his father had disappeared with that truck 32 years ago. Richard stood frozen inside Samuel's garage. He slowly turned the old photograph around. There was a younger man standing beside the same 1968 Chevrolet C10. Richard's eyes filled with disbelief. That truck. Samuel looked at him. You know it? Richard nodded. My father owned one just like this. Samuel became completely still. What was his name? Richard swallowed hard. Thomas Hale. Samuel lowered his eyes. For a few seconds, neither man spoke. Then Samuel quietly walked to an old wooden cabinet. He opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a faded mechanic's notebook. He placed it on the workbench. Richard opened the first page. His father's name was written there, Thomas Hale. Richard looked at Samuel. You knew my father? Samuel nodded. 32 years ago, he came to this mountain town with this truck. Richard could barely breathe. My father disappeared when I was 23. Samuel looked toward the old C10. He didn't disappear because he wanted to leave you. Richard's eyes widened. Then what happened? Samuel took a slow breath. Your father was driving through these mountains when the truck broke down. He came to my garage. He was carrying something important. Richard stepped closer. What was it? Samuel didn't answer. Instead, he opened the driver's door of the C10. Under the old dashboard was a small metal plate. Richard stared at it. He recognized the initials immediately. T.H., his father's initials. Richard stepped backward. My God. Samuel finally told him the part he had never told anyone. Your father asked me to repair the truck. But before he left, he asked me to keep something safe. Richard's voice became quiet. What? Samuel pointed toward the old Chevrolet. Something that belonged to you. Richard stared at the truck. For 32 years, he had believed his father had abandoned him. But now he was standing beside the same truck his father had driven on the last day anyone saw him. Then Samuel said something Richard never expected. Your father came back once. Richard froze. When? 6 months later. Richard's eyes filled with tears. Why didn't he come home? Samuel looked toward the cabin, then at Evelyn, then back at Richard. Because he believed going home would put his family in danger. Richard's expression changed. What are you talking about? Samuel walked to the back of the C10. He removed an old panel that had been hidden behind years of repairs. Inside was a small metal box. Richard stared at it. Samuel didn't open it. He simply said, Your father told me never to give this to anyone, unless his son came looking for the truck. Richard's hands began to tremble. You've been waiting all these years? Samuel nodded. I didn't know if you'd ever come. Richard looked at the elderly mechanic, then at Evelyn sitting quietly inside the cabin. He finally understood why Samuel had refused his money, why he had spent every night restoring the old truck, why he had never sold it. Samuel wasn't restoring an old Chevrolet. He was keeping a promise. Richard looked at the metal box. Then he noticed something else, a medical bill sitting quietly on Samuel's workbench. Richard looked toward Evelyn, then back at Samuel. He understood. Samuel had been trying to save his wife's life while protecting a promise he had carried for more than 3 decades. Richard slowly picked up the medical bill. How much do you need? Samuel immediately shook his head. No. Richard looked at him. This isn't charity. Samuel remained silent. Richard continued. My father left something unfinished, and you kept it safe. Let me finish something for you. Samuel's eyes filled with tears, but Richard still hadn't opened the metal box. He looked at Samuel. Should I? Samuel nodded. Richard slowly lifted the lid. Inside was something neither of them expected to see, a small handwritten note and a photograph of a young Richard standing beside his father. Richard covered his mouth. The photograph was dated 3 days before his father disappeared. On the back was 7 words. I never stopped trying to come home. Richard broke down in tears. Samuel placed a hand on his shoulder. For the first time in 32 years, Richard finally knew the truth, and for the first time in months, Samuel and Evelyn had a reason to believe their darkest days might finally be ending, because Richard